I'm here to tell the story of my son, James Quintana. I speak about him because that's my way of keeping his memory alive. James was an addict for a very long time. He had been clean for a long time. He broke up with his long-term girlfriend and he couldn't cope, so he relapsed and he met somebody else. And I believe that she was using, but not every day. And then together they just started using every day throughout the day. He told me that there were some people that wanted him to sell heroin and he didn't want to do it. Because James was actually working or volunteering at an outpatient rehab in Espanola, New Mexico, because that's where his girlfriend worked. She was a CPSW. And his efforts were to try to reach as many people as he could for them not to do drugs. He also suffered bipolar and schizophrenia. So I think that because of those diseases, it made it harder for him to stay clean. He didn't do well with life events like the breakup. He just didn't deal with them very well. He didn't like to be let down. It was very hard for him to kind of bounce back. And so he met this girl. I didn't like her from the very beginning, so he and I would fight about it. And the first fight we had was because I told him, that girl had her feet on my couch. I was like, she had her dirty feet on my couch. I was like, I don't even put my feet on my couch. And he was like, oh my God, I can't even believe you're just fighting with me about her feet. She's clean. And I was like, I don't care. Her feet were on my couch. So he was like, fine, I won't invite her here again. And I was like, fine, it's my house. And so she invited him to go live with her, and so I didn't have to worry about her putting her feet on my couch anymore. But I used to worry about him all the time, and we used to try to have dinners together, and I tried to accept her how she was because that's who he loved. And so, they fought just like everybody else does, and he wanted to leave her, and he had moved a lot of his things out of the house because he said he didn't want to do drugs anymore. And so he was trying to stay away from her because he knew that if he was with her, she was just going to go out and buy it for the both of them. So he stayed away from her for a while, and he called me on a Sunday night, 2 nights before he passed away, and he says, you're going to be very angry at me. And I said, why? And he says, I'm back with Andrea again. And I said, you're an adult. I can't tell you who to love. If she's who you love, then love her. But I can't make that decision for you. You're an adult. And I said, all I can do is wish you the best and stay away from using. I said, because I told him, you're a very good person. I said, but for you to use, I said, it breaks my heart. I said, because there's nothing that I can do to stop you. And I didn't hear from him on Monday. And then at 5:30 in the morning, Tuesday morning, the phone rang. James used to go eat breakfast at my house every morning at 5:30 or 6 in the morning. And so it was about 5:30 and the phone rang, and I told my husband, go open the door. James is here, because you couldn't hear. If anybody knocked on the door, I couldn't hear it in my bedroom. So I would tell him, call me and I'll go open the door. And his name came up on the caller ID, and I said, go open the door. James is here. I said, he's here to have breakfast. And my husband comes back in the room, and by that time I had already thrown the phone. I don't even remember where I threw my phone. I got dressed a second time, and he said, what's going on? And I said, the paramedics are working on James. And he said, what? And he says, Andrea just called. And so when she called, all she said was, they're working on him. And I said, what? She goes, they're working on him. And I said, what the? F are you talking about? And she said, they're working on him. And I said, then in the background, I could hear the paramedics saying, come on, buddy, stay with us. And I told her, the paramedics are working on him? And she said, yes. And I told her, I'll be right there. So that's when I threw the phone in the air, got dressed a second time. My legs were shaking really bad. I don't even know how I got in the truck. We got in my husband's truck, and James lived about 15 or 20 minutes away from me. I didn't realize it, but Leroy was driving 100 miles per hour. We were trying to get to James, and right when you get into Espanola, there's a theater called the Dreamcatcher, and we're making that turn. And all of a sudden, this feeling came over me, and I felt like I was just melting. I felt like a noodle, like I was just going to just fall off of the passenger seat. And my husband said, what's going on? And I told him, I said, I think my son is okay, or my son died. And he said, don't say that. And I was like, you don't understand what I'm feeling. Like there was this ringing in my ears, and that's just this feeling. It just like my life had left my body. And while I was going through that motion, Andrea didn't have the audacity to call me and tell me that James died. She texted, oh my God, he's dead now. And I told Leroy, I said, he died. And he said, what? And Leroy accelerated, and we got there, and we were like 3 minutes away from his home. And we drive down there, and there's a lot of police there, and the neighbors had already started kind of like circling the residents. And I jump off of the truck, and there's a guy standing in their driveway, and the police are like, have him kind of blocked in. And he's standing there, and he looked at me, and I looked at the guy, and I was like, I was like, you need to get out of here now. I go, you brought it to him, didn't you? And he just nodded his head, and I was yelling at him and cussing at him, and I just wanted him out of there, because I knew that he was the one that had taken whatever my son had done. And it took 4 police officers and my husband to kind of pull me down, and because I wanted to go and tear that guy apart. And so it took 4 police officers and my husband to hold me down, and I wanted to go in the house, and they said, you can't go in. The paramedics came out, and they said, I'm sorry. We did everything that we could. And being that I had worked at the Espanola Hospital, I was very well known. And I also knew the police officers, and I knew the paramedics. And so I thanked them for their efforts, but they still wouldn't let me go in. But before I was able to go in, the police officers were all standing in a circle. And they had been asking me questions, asking me, who did he hang around with? We need to know. And I was just like, James lived his street life. James was gang affiliated. He never brought that to my house. I would always tell him, if you're going to come to my house, you park down the street. You don't bring anybody into my driveway, into my yard. You don't bring anybody into my home, because this is my sacred place. This is my sanctuary. I said, you can have the friends that you want. I said, but don't come close. Don't bring them close to my house. And so James tried to hide who he hung around with and who he was with, because I'm very blunt, and I would tell them, I don't like you. I don't want you here. I don't want you around my son. And my son was just like, Jesus, Mom, they're my friends. And I was like, they're not your friends. And so he just knew better to bring anybody around. So I told the police, I was like, he didn't take anybody around, because I didn't allow him to have anybody around my space. And I said he lived his life, and whether I liked it or not, he was an adult, and he was going to live his life the way he wanted. And so anyway, I went out, and before OMI, I was standing by the gate, and then the cops were standing around in a circle, and this one cop said, he goes, he's one less piece of shit that we need to deal with. And I looked at him, and I said, excuse me? I said, what did you say? And he said, I didn't say anything. And I said, I heard you. I heard what you said. I said, if you're going to be on that side of the fence, on the law side, and you're going to come to a call where somebody just passed away, and you're going to call that person a piece of shit and let the family hear it. I told him, you're part of the problem. And I told him, I said, oh, wait a minute here. I said, you're the officer, I said, that wasn't faithful to your wife, and you have a child with somebody else. I said, and you're not holding yourself accountable. He goes, how do you know that? And I said, social media. I said, the other woman, I said, is saying what she has to say about you. I said, that's how I know. I said, so I guess we're going to turn the tables here. I said, you're the piece of shit. And he just stayed really quiet and goes, I really didn't say that. And I said, I heard you. And so I go around the group and I'm telling these officers, just because you wear a badge doesn't mean that you guys don't have demons that you fight on your own. I said, because you're a closet alcoholic. And I start going around, telling them what I know about them. And this one officer had also even said, like earlier, he said, if he pulls through this, he's a lucky son of a... He said, and I'm going to haul him right off to jail. He goes, because if I'm not mistaken, he may have a warrant. And I was just like, he's laying in there dead. You already know he's dead. I said, and you're talking about if he isn't, you're going to haul him to jail. I told him, you haven't even graduated from the academy. I said, and you're standing here talking crap. And he goes, ma'am, I didn't say anything. They were all, I didn't say anything. And I said, yes, you did. And my husband's like, oh, Caroline, you're going to get arrested. And I was like, I don't care. I said, if you're worried about me going to jail, there's bail money in the top drawer at the house. OMI finally got there, and her name was Lynn. And she pronounced him, and then they let me go in the house. So me and my husband went in the house first, and the girl Andrea kept going in and out of the house with James's dog Lacey. But she didn't even she didn't show any remorse, which made me a little more angry at her. Because I thought, how could you live with somebody for almost 2 years and not have any remorse? And her phone kept on ringing, and I heard her tell somebody to please take her something because she needed it, and made me a little more angry. And I was just like, there's my son laying dead in her living room, and she's calling somebody to bring her something. And she went and she sat with her mom and her stepdad, and I kind of just kept my focus on myself. And then there was a little boy that lived a few mobile homes down, and the little boy just broke my heart. He was like, what's going on? He said, my friend. He goes, my friend lives there. And he was ready to cry, and I told him, I said, I don't know what's going on in there. I told him, I said, maybe you should go home. I said, but when everything is done, I said, we'll go tell you what's going on. And he goes, he's my friend. He said, he's so good to me, he said, and he plays games with me. He goes, he's a crazy guy. He said, but he's my friend. He goes, he brings me McDonald's, and he's good to me, he said. And he said, I just want to know that my friend's okay. And I told him, I said, I'm sure he's okay. He said, but if you go home, I said, I'll go to your house later. Which house do you live in? I'll go to your house later. And he said, okay. He said, do you promise? And I said, I promise. And the little boy just broke my heart, because James was so good to everybody. James used to make me angry because he would work and he would get a paycheck. And if somebody came up to him and said, hey, James, how much did you make on your paycheck? And if James says, oh, I made $500. Oh, you know what, James, I need $499. James would be like, you know what, I just got paid. Let me give you that $499. He didn't care about himself he cared that he would be able to give somebody else in their time of need. And he would just give and give. And I was just like, James, why do you give? When you need something, who is there for you? And he said, nobody. And I said, exactly. So why are you there for everybody? You need to take care of yourself. He was so giving and so compassionate. And he never wanted for anybody else to hurt. But he hurt. James suffered a lot of depression. He was very, very down on himself all the time. And he never gave himself the credit he deserved to give himself. I was finally able to go in the home, and I saw James laying there. They had intubated him. He did have the leads on him, but he had some other stuff like on his legs and on his arms, kind of like where they must have tried to give him some medication or something. They Narcaned him 4 times. A paramedic did say that they were able to bring him back a couple of times, but he just was breathing too shallow and they couldn't save him. So he was laying there and he just looked so peaceful. So Lynn allowed me to lay next to my son. I told Lynn I would like to put my son in the body bag, and she said, "What?" And I said, "I would like to put my son in the body bag." And she said, "Do you know what you're asking?" And I said, "Yes, I do." I said, "I'm in the medical profession," I said, "and I have bagged," I said, "many people." I said, "with the utmost respect." I said, "And this is my child," I said, "and I feel like I owe it to him to put him in the bag," I said. And she goes, "If you feel like you can do it." And she hands me over the body bag, and she goes, "Your son's a big guy." She said, "You're going to need some help." And I said, "I know." I said, "And I'm going to go get help." And my husband's like, "Oh, do you want me to help you?" And I was like, "No. There's a specific person," I said, "that I want to help me." And he says, "Well, where are you going?" I said, "I'm going outside." And so I go outside, and these police officers are still standing out there. And I said, I looked at them, and they looked at me, and I said, "I need an asshole." And they're like, "Oh, excuse me?" And I was like, "I need an asshole." I said, "You're the asshole I need." And I pointed at the police officer that had called my son a piece of shit. And he goes, "What do you need?" And I said, "You're going to help me put my son in a body bag." And he goes, "You're not allowed to do that." And I said, "Well, today I am." I said, "OMI said I can, and you're going to help me." And so he followed me, and he goes, "I am really sorry." And I said, "You already said what you said." I said, "I feel how I feel." I said, "An apology not accepted." I said, "But you are going to help me put my son in this body bag." And he said, "Okay." So he helped me roll James over. We put James in the body bag, and I said, "I don't need you anymore." And I said, "You're dismissed. You can go." And so I zipped James up to the waist, and then my daughter came in, and my daughter was crying, and she was devastated. They were very close. And then they asked me what funeral home we were going to use, and I told them, and they said, "Well, they can't be here for about 45 more minutes." And I said, "Can I please hold my son?" And she said, "He's your baby. You do what you need to do." And she allowed me to lay next to him and just hold him, because that was initially going to be the last time that I was going to be able to hold my child. I think James knew that he was going to die. He had been telling me that he was feeling like something was going to happen to him. About a month before he passed away, he came in and he was just crying, and he was just like really sobbing. And I was like, he scared me, and I was like, "What's the matter?" I said, "What happened?" I said, "Did something happen, James?" And he said, "No, Mom." He said, "Nothing happened." He said, "But I need to talk to you." And I was like, "Did you do something wrong?" And he was like, "No." He goes, "Well," he was just crying uncontrollably. He said, "Mom," he said, "I just want you to know that you are the best mom that anybody could ever have. And I want you to know that anything that I've done in my life has been my choice. And I don't ever want you to feel guilty for anything that I've done, because you were the best mom that anybody could have ever asked for. You did everything for me and my sister." He goes, "And if we've done anything, we've made those choices. They were our choices." He goes, "But please promise me," he said, "that no matter what," he said, "just remember not to feel guilty for anything that I've done in my life, because it was my choice." And I just hugged him, and I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. I was like, oh, it's okay. I was like, you're my son no matter what. I said, I don't like some of the things that you do. I said, but those are your choices. I said, and I told him I have, my faults. I said, I feel bad for ever letting you go live with your dad. James moved out of my house when he was 15 years old because I was too strict. He said he couldn't do anything. He said he felt like he felt like he was in the military. And I would tell him, guess what? This is my house. These are my rules. And you will live by my rules. And you're only 15. You have 3 more years. And if you don't want to live in my house, you could go live with your dad. And I think that was one of my biggest regrets, one of my biggest mistakes that I could have ever made. Because James came to live here in Albuquerque with his dad. And his dad is the one that introduced him to the drugs. James started selling drugs at the age of 16. His dad was his biggest customer. And James grew to like the street life, living life in the fast lane. I always knew when he was doing drugs because he wouldn't come around, he wouldn't call because he didn't want me to hear him. He didn't want me to see him under the influence. So I always knew when James was not doing well. His dad took no accountability for teaching our son how and what the drug life was all about. I was angry with his dad for a very long time. I had to face another harsh little lesson in James's death. I didn't want his dad there for his services. I didn't want anybody that was gang affiliated there that wasn't going to be respectful. I told them that if they were going to go to James's services, that they needed to show respect and that we were not going to go in acting like gangsters from the street. I didn't want them to go dressed in their gang attire or act the way they did. I just didn't want it. I didn't want his dad there, but I couldn't cremate James without his dad's signature because he was on the birth certificate. And so my daughter really wanted me for me to make peace with her dad, and I didn't feel like I needed to. And I made that very clear to him that he was there because I needed a signature. And I just told him that I would never forgive him for teaching James how to live that kind of a life. Out of all of his friends, I think there was only 5 people that showed up to James's services. The rest was just family members. I didn't allow the girl to come to the services because I felt like she had been very disrespectful, and I felt like the damages had already been done. So I didn't allow her to go to the services either. And James had some really good services. My husband did at the services go and pull the father of my children and told him, your son is lying in that casket and you owe it to her to go and stand next to her and pay your last respects to your child because that was your child with her, and you owe it to her to go stand next to her and say goodbye to your son for the last time before they close the casket. And he grabbed the father of my kids from his hand and walked him to the casket. And my husband put his hand on my back and he said, you both were parents to James, and you both tell your son goodbye. And I turned and I told him that I forgave him, that James would want for me to forgive and not to be bitter or resentful. And his dad didn't say anything to me, and he went back to his seat, and I went to mine. My son didn't die in vain. His death, I don't believe, should be a negative thing. I'm trying to make a positive thing out of it. Because, like I said, he didn't die in vain, and he will reach thousands through me. If I could help one person, then I've done my job. Grieving your child is not an easy thing in life. A parent should never have to bury their child. In my case, I didn't have him buried. He's at home with me. I had him cremated, so he's at home with me, and I'm comfortable with that. Before he passed away, he said when he died, he wanted to be cremated and he wanted to be at home with me. So I've granted him his request, and I think that it's the best request that I could have given him because I'm comfortable with it. He's at home with me. I used to tell him all the time, when you die, I'm going to cremate you and I'm going to put you in my living room so that I'll know where you're at all the time. I won't have to be looking for you ever again. So he's at home with me, and he brings me great peace. He's a wonderful soul. He messes with me sometimes. He gives me signs. He used to smoke cigarettes, and I used to tell him, please don't smoke outside of my window. And so he used to go to the window and blow smoke in the window on purpose just to get me riled up. I live in a bi-level home, and there's times like at 11:30 o'clock at night, I can smell cigarette smoke. There's nobody around that smokes cigarettes, and there's nobody that could be there to smoke outside of the window on a second level of a building. And so I smell it, and I'm like, okay, my son is here visiting. One night, or actually it was into the morning, it was about 4:20 in the morning, and all of a sudden my phone's giving these notifications, and it was iTunes, and I was like, my phone isn't set up that way. Why am I getting these notifications? And the song came on. It was a song that he liked. It was a song called Second Chance by Shinedown. And then after that, it was just like 4 or 5 songs. It was just music that he liked. And to me, that was a sign that he was waking me up. And I thought, well, I'm going to go get some water. And so my husband and I are just kind of awake talking about him and just memories. And my husband said, I'm going to go get some water. And then he says, did you spill water in the kitchen? And I was like, why would I spill water in the kitchen? It's a bottled water. Like, why am I going to open the bottled water and throw? I was like, I didn't even know you were going to go into the kitchen. And so I get up, and we're both looking to see, like, where's the water coming from? There was no reason why there would have been water on the floor. But I said to myself, it was James again, just him playing his little games. I'm very open and receptive to the signs that he gives. And I believe that my son has given me, or he has shown me, the beauty in life, and he shows me the beauty in death. For some reason, when he was alive, I guess I just felt I was so busy all the time worrying about him, always wondering where he was and making sure he was okay. I'm an end-of-life doula, so I do take care of people who are transitioning into the next world. And so sometimes my mind is just very busy because I'm thinking about everybody. And I don't think I really ever stopped to look at the beauty around me, to see the sky in the way that I look at it now, or to appreciate a rainbow the way I do now. I always noticed butterflies, but now it's just like butterflies seem to gravitate towards me more. I always say, oh, there goes James. If it's more than one, it's James and a buddy or somebody else that has passed along. Sometimes it's even just a scripture. If it's in the winter and there's no butterflies, I'll be watching a movie and there's butterflies in the movie, and he's just a constant reminder of beautiful things, and I think that's how he would have wanted me to remember him. He visits me in my dreams, and I know that he's at peace. I know that he's in a better place. I was talking to Danielle out there, and I was telling her that I've dreamt of him where he's at. It's very nice. It's very peaceful. It's beautiful. He was sitting like in this balcony, and the whole balcony was made out of marble. And there was some birds chirping in the background. There's green trees and just a very beautiful, quiet, peaceful space. And he was a tattoo artist. He used to love to sketch and draw, and he was just constantly sketching. And in the dream, he's sitting at this beautiful marble table, and he's just sitting there, and he's just sketching away. He looked up, and he's looking around, and then he looks back down, and he's sketching again. Most of my dreams about him are very peaceful. One of the very first dreams that I had of him, he was wearing a blue shirt and some blue jeans, and we were sitting across from each other, and we were in an airplane. And then he looked away, and I looked to see where he was looking, and then we were in a train, and it was just these different modes of transportation. And then I felt so peaceful just to see that he was well, and that he was peaceful, and he was very nicely groomed the way he liked to be, but he didn't talk in the dream. And then a few months later, I was offered an opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. to an event called Trail of Truth. And so Trail of Truth is a lot of people who gather together to memorialize their loved ones who have passed away from substance abuse. And they do it in Washington, D.C. in front of Capitol Hill. So what we do is we replicate a cemetery in front of Capitol Hill. And there's people from all over the United States. There's a group of us, Ralph Martinez, Jennifer Manzanares, and I. We represent New Mexico. We try to collect as many submissions as we can from New Mexico. There's a little group or a section on that lawn that they're starting to do for each state. So we have a little group, a little section where the people from New Mexico have the opportunity to send in a submission of their loved one, and a fake tombstone is created for their loved one. And every September, we get together on the third, I think it's like the third Saturday in September. And there's lots of guest speakers, and we get to know each other. We get to talk about our loved ones. At the end of the event, we protest in front of the Department of Health, and we protest in the front of the Department of Labor. And then the event is over for the day. But when you go to that event, it's so breathtaking. The first time that I went, I got off of the rental car that we were on, and I just saw all of the tombstones, and it made me so sad, and it gave me a lot of anxiety, because I felt like there I was again looking for my child. I didn't know where his tombstone was. And I'm going row by row, just, and my friends are like helping me look for his tombstone. And we're just like, he's not here. And I was just like, what if they forgot? What if they, out of all of these people, they forgot to make his tombstone and he's not here? And I started panicking. And this young woman, volunteer, they call them the Rainmakers, came up to me and she was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "No, I'm not." I told her, I said, "I can't find my son." And she said, "What's your son's name?" And I said, "His name is James Quintana." She goes, "I know where he's at." She said, "He's wearing a white shirt. He's leaning against the tree, very handsome guy." She said, "His tombstone has praying hands on it." She says, "I know where he's at." She goes, "I'll take you right to it." So James always liked to be the center of attention. He was right in the front, facing the stage, and He actually wasn't there when she took me to look. He was on a wagon and they were pulling him in. And I was like, of course, it was just like him. He had to make his little grand entrance. And so she takes his tombstone off the wagon and she places it in the lawn. And she goes, "Do you feel better now?" And I was like, "Yes." And I just felt the relief. I was like, he's here. But I also felt his spirit there. And at the end of the day, when they were taking the tombstones, because each parent or volunteer gets their loved one's tombstone, and they carry that tombstone with them on the protest. And so I pick up his tombstone, and I'm looking around, and I was like, all of these other tombstones don't have a loved one here with them. So I start picking up as many tombstones as I can, because I was like, I can't leave these behind. I have to take them with me. As many as I can, I'm going to take. And one of the volunteers goes, "Don't worry about that." She said, "We're going to get all of the tombstones that are left behind. We're going to put them on the wagon, and we're going to follow you later." But for me, I was just like, how can I leave all of these behind? I can't. They have to come with us. And so I picked up as many as I could, and we're doing our march. We stayed in Washington for a few days, and on my last day, I was just like, I have to leave something here that belongs to James, a picture or something, And then I thought, well, I'll leave his picture here. And then I thought, well, why am I going to leave it at the Airbnb? Whoever comes to clean is just going to throw the picture in the trash, because they have no idea who he is or why we're here. And then all of a sudden, I feel like I'm having this conversation with him. Like, he's telling me that he wants to stay in Washington. And I'm just like, well, why would you want to stay in Washington? We're not even from here. But I felt like he must have had like a connection with all of those other tombstones. I felt like he wanted to go back to the park and stay there with the many tombstones that were left behind. Or maybe that just all of those, angels were there in spirit. And so I just kind of had a little talk with him, and I said, you can stay here if you want, but I got to go back home, and I'll be back next year in September. So that's how I left it. But I felt like a piece of him stayed in Washington. So every year I go back to Washington to memorialize him and the many others. Plus, I feel like I have this whole new family. For once, I feel like I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one grieving. I'm not the only one grieving for this reason. And there's so many of us that are fighting this fight to end this fentanyl crisis, this epidemic, this horrible epidemic that is killing so many people. And the main thing is to let everybody know that our loved ones were so much more than their addiction, and they didn't deserve to die. I feel like our government is failing us. And this example has been given so many times. So we have this fentanyl crisis going on. It's everywhere. And there's about 200 people that die per day. But if these 200 people were on an airplane and they crashed, they would do something about it. They would get down to the reason why that airplane crashed, or what. They would get down to the root of why all of these passengers lost their lives. Right. But there's nobody fighting this fentanyl crisis to see, like, how are we going to stop these 200 people from dying every day? And they don't do it because they're addicts. Some of them have had a long history of addiction. Some of them may have taken a pill for the first time and didn't even know that it was laced with fentanyl. I don't think that any of our loved ones thought, you know what, today I'm going to take this fentanyl and I'm just going to die. If they would have known that they were going to die that day, I don't think they would have chosen to take that drug. I cope with my grief by being a community activist, raising awareness for substance abuse. And supporting others that are grieving just like me, because I know I'm not alone. James's death has given me a purpose. His death, he didn't deserve it. Nobody deserves it. Nobody's child, nobody that has died from fentanyl deserves that kind of a death. But if I can raise awareness and I can help somebody else and be resourceful, then I'm keeping his memory alive. I don't only memorialize him once a year. I try to memorialize him every single day, because that's what he deserved. James can't walk and he can't talk, but I can. And I will do that for him. I feel that James will reach thousands through me. And I will keep doing this until my last day.